A reading from the Gospel of John. After this, there was a festival of the Judeans, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool called in Hebrew Bethzatha, which has 5 porticoes. And in these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years, and when Jesus saw him lying there and knew he'd been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat, and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath. So the authorities of the temple said to the man who'd been cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your mat." But he answered them, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" And they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take it up and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared in the crowd that was there. And later Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you've been made well. Do not sin any more, so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and told the temple authorities that it was Jesus who had made him well. Therefore, the authorities started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, saying, "My Father is still working, and I also am working." For this reason, the authorities were seeking all the more to kill Jesus, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but he was also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God. There's an awful lot in this passage from John, and as we draw towards the end of our Lenten time, the people who put our lectionary together are starting to point us to the conflict that is building around Jesus and his ministry of healing. But I want to focus today on that wonderful exchange with the man who'd been lying by the porticos for 38 years. And when you stop and think about it, that means he'd been lying there for the entirety of Jesus' life, from the time when Jesus was brought up to have his naming or his ritual of presentation. He was there when Jesus was 12 and sitting and teaching with authority and getting lost by his parents. And he's here still when Jesus is in his early 30s, presumably. And so not only Jesus was aware he'd been there for some time, because this man had been there Jesus' entire life. And Jesus asks the man, "Do you want to be made well? Do you want to be made well?" It's a reasonable question, because somebody who'd been there the entire lifetime for Jesus, and a long time, somehow had managed not to make it down to the waters to receive the miraculous healing powers of the waters and to be made well. And then, of course, when he asks it, the man gives a very reasonable explanation. "I'm a little bit on the feeble side. Once those waters start stirring," which was the thought, the waters stir, and if you can get down to them and get into them, you'll be healed. He says, "People are shoving me aside. I'm marginalized." And Jesus just cuts through all that and says, "But do you want to be made well?" And that is a very reasonable question. I think Jesus, they didn't have the discipline as we have it now, but Jesus would have been an excellent therapist. And I think it's a question for you and me in this time of Lent, as we continue on, and we've been offering to God those places in our lives in need of healing. One of the things we do during Lent, along with giving of alms and study and prayer, we are repenting. We're asking God to help us with those places in our lives that we've identified that are in need of healing. And I think it's a reasonable question for any one of us. Most of us, I think, when we have something that's chronically been with us over the years, maybe even over the entire lifetime of someone, if we are still struggling, are we like this man who has a very reasonable explanation about why we haven't been healed yet? It's somebody else's fault, or there's some reasonable logistical problem with us getting healed. But Jesus looks this man in the eyes, and I'd like us to imagine today Jesus looking you and me in the eyes and asking, you know, we're here in the fourth week of Lent, and we're still having the same question before us that we've had for some time. Jesus looking in our eyes and asking, do you want to be made well? And if Jesus were to ask me that, and my answer were yes, and I really kind of cut what I hear in Jesus' story here, the story of the man in the porticoes, is Jesus kind of cutting to the chase and asking, do you want to be made well? And in that direct connection with Christ, with Jesus, is it possible that if we were to be just that direct, and if God were to be just that direct with us, what is it that could happen? And I think it's human nature to get comfortable with our imperfections, to get comfortable with the things that are keeping us from being our full selves, to get comfortable with the things that are in need of healing, frankly. And even when healing is offered, it's possible for us to say, no, not really. Yes, in theory, I'd like to be made well, but I've actually kind of built a whole life around how I am. So I think that's a really good question for you and me to take from today's gospel reading from John. Do you want to be made well? And if the answer is yes, and you really present that to God, what will God's answer, what will Christ's answer be to you? What's the invitation that will come to you next? For the man in the Gospel's message today, it was take up your mat and walk. It'll probably be different for you and me, or it may be different for you and me. But if Jesus bids us to pick up our mat and walk, will we do it? May God be with you in that meditation this day. May God bless you and keep you this day and always. Amen.